It's really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. My name is Julien Vignon, and I am AI Policy Lead at the Ministry of Finance and Digital Affairs in France. The topic of today will be around AI regulation. So it's a very broad topic. For instance, in Paris this week, we had the second high-level meeting of the TTC Council with the working group specifically dedicated to AI. But today the subject will be more specifically focused on the proposed EU AI regulation that we will discuss with our panel today. A few points of order because I want to mention before our discussion, this is broadcast live. This is also recorded and will be put online at a later stage. Also, some speakers today will speak in English and some others will speak in French, and interpretation will be provided when this recorded video is put online. So let me also welcome our high-level panelists today. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome Kilian Gross. Kilian, you are head of unit. You work at the DG CNECT, and you are managing artificial intelligence policy development and coordination. It's really a pleasure to have you on our panel today. Also, we have Julia Fenart. Julia, you are European Public Affairs and Communications Director for France Digitale. This is the largest startup organization in Europe. France Digitale brings together champions of digital entrepreneurship because it gathers 1,800 digital startups with strong growth plans and more than 100 investors. So we'll be keen to hear about what you think of the AI regulation. Next with us, we have Francesco Cerruti. You are Director General at the Italian Tech Alliance. In the past, you've also worked in the European Parliament. A few words about the Italian Tech Alliance. This is the association of those who invest, innovate, experiment, and discover new technologies to foster the growth of Italy. So it also will be interesting to hear your perspectives, given that you are promoting the needs not only of capital fund, but also business angels, family office, startups, and innovative SMEs. So pleasure to have you with us, Francesco. And last but certainly not least, we have Jean-Claude Laroche. Jean-Claude, you are President of the CIGREF, and you are also Chief Information Officer of Enedis. In a nutshell, CIGREF is an association that represents the biggest businesses and French public administrations that are users of digital solutions and digital services. So we'll be keen to hear your views on the proposed AI regulation. So let's dive in now into our subjects. And I would maybe like to start with a question for you, Kilian, because how can I put it? You are maybe the architect, and you and your team behind the proposed AI regulation. So I'd be very keen to hear if you could let us know how you think the AI Act is striking the balance between promoting innovation and providing for a sound regulatory framework. I think is really this balance that all of us are looking after, because the act is not something that only forbids, but it's also an act that needs to enable the technology. So what are your perspective on this question?
So thanks a lot for Julien, for this nice introduction, and thanks a lot for being with you today on this important event and to discuss with you an act which is, of course, very close to our heart. And because, as you rightly put out, my team and myself, we basically try to develop this act, which is now discussed in Council and Parliament, and we hope we will find political agreements somewhere next year, not too late. Our policy, and I think you described this very well, our policy on AI was always that we want to promote AI. We think AI makes a lot of sense, not only for the economy, but as well for society. For instance, the energy transformation will not be achieved without AI. So we are convinced that we need a lot of AI in the future, and we want to boost that development. That's why we have presented together with the Act a coordinated plan how to foster the development and uptake of AI. Nevertheless, we are aware of the risks of AI, and we think here we need a horizontal legislation which is risk-based. So we should only intervene as much and as far as the risks really require this. And if we manage to do this, then we think this can really be an innovation-friendly legislation, because it will create the trust. Because the uptake of AI, one thing is, of course, the supply and the development. The other thing is the uptake of AI. And the uptake will very much depend on the trust which companies, but as well private consumers, have for this technology. So scandals like we've seen, for instance, in the Netherlands are very harmful, of course, for such a technology. So that can really put the reputation into question. Therefore, we think it's in the common interest of business and of consumers to have clear rules how this technology can be trustworthy. And that's what the AI Act tries to do. First, to identify what is AI, what is really high risk, so where do we need to intervene, because if there is no risk, we don't need to intervene, and this should be the large majority of cases. As well, this is a strong message for the market, because it shows that here there is no risk. You can just rely on the system. If it's not good, the market will basically carve it out. If it's good, it will be taken up. That's fine. But for high risk, like for recruitment tools, for AI tools in justice or in autonomous cars, then we need quality requirements. And that's in a nutshell what we propose on the basis of the work of our high-level group, 5 requirements, which should ensure then that the AI system placed on the market, used on the market, is safe, trustworthy, and respects fundamental rights. And this should be checked in the next under-conformity assessment. So we treat the AI like a product. And we have a lot of experience in Europe, I think, with products, because we have cars, we have very complex products where we have ex-ante conformity assessment robots, and we try now to do the same for AI. So we try to, and this was as well a call from business, to translate the abstract ethical requirements into concrete requirements, which then will be translated into standards. And what we heard from business is really regulation is perhaps sometimes a bit tedious, but regulation is okay as long as it's clear. So we really made a lot of effort to be clear, so to have clear cut requirements before which an AI system needs to meet when it's developed, before it goes to the market. And last but not least, of course, what is very important, and that's, I think, why with these standards, we can be very pragmatic and very practical and very clear. We are, of course, aware, and I guess this will later on be a topic of this discussion, that in particular for smaller companies, for startups, for SMEs, this may still be a burden, because, of course, there is a certain regulation needs to be respected. We think there's as well a chance, because the label of being trustworthy will allow as well a startup to sell or to offer AI in a very critical and sensitive area. But we have as well foreseen in the Act particular measures to support innovation and startups, like sandboxes, facilitated reduced fees, and other elements which should help them. So we try to develop a special regime for startups, because we know this is very much where the innovation comes from. So altogether, we think we have found a balance. Of course, this is now under the scrutiny of the co-legislators, but we had from the beginning the idea to find a good balance between making AI trustworthy and therefore improving the uptake of AI, and allowing still innovation to come and to flourish in Europe.
Right. Thank you so much. So there are a lot of things that we can unwrap here. So I'd be keen to hear Julia's perspective. We've heard Kilian speak a lot about the role of innovation and the key role, for instance, of sandboxes, the special attention given to SMEs. So, Julia, what is your diagnostics on the AI Act as it is proposed? Do you think it's clear enough? Do you think it pays enough attention to SMEs? And what, in your opinion, are the best things about it?
Thank you so much, Julien. And hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here to present and speak a little bit of the potential impact of the AI Act on startups. And I think that maybe first, what we need to do is to specify what are we talking about exactly when we talk about AI startups, and how important are they in the AI landscape, actually. I'd like to give you a few figures. In France, we have more than 500 AI startups, and that's the number for last year, 2021, which is an 11% increase in comparison to 2020. So we can see that we have an amazing trend in the creation of AI startups in France, and I think that's also reflected elsewhere in Europe. These companies that we're talking about, they are young. 73% of them were created less than 6 years ago. The good news and the excellent news is that they attract more and more investors. In France, it was 2 billion euros that were raised for AI startups last year, which is twice as much as 2020. So I think that the trend here is really impressive. And these companies also, they create jobs. In France, we have more than 15,000 people working for AI startups. And if we are a little bit forward-looking, what is interesting is that they plan on creating 10,000 jobs this year only. However, we know already that unfortunately they will not manage to do so because we have an important tech skills gap in the professional market. But still, I think what I mean by this is that we have an AI market that is flourishing, and that we should be looking at the potential impact on these economic actors with the techs. So what we did at France Digitale is that we gathered more than 100 startups to analyze the text. So we did analyze the white paper of the Commission, and then we analyzed the first draft. And the conclusion is that, with all the startups, we agree that we welcome the ambition of regulating and promoting European values and having a more ethical AI. And we agree also on the fact that the new regulatory burden should not discourage AI founders and investors from engaging in Europe. And I think it's interesting also to take, the VC, the capital, the venture capital perspective on this as well. We must ensure that AI startups in Europe remain the #1 choice for investors, so that it's still attractive for them to invest in AI startups in Germany, in Sweden, in Spain, rather than choosing maybe a foreign alternative, because AI startups are also flourishing elsewhere in the world. So what I mean by this is that we need to remain competitive in the international stage, and so that's with these lenses that we've analyzed the text. And I think we have good solutions, and there are things that can be improved in the text so that we achieve this goal and this perspective. We've identified a lack of clarity on the scope of the text. Some technical, we are questioning some technical feasibility also on certain obligations, and I can also detail that a little bit later. And we appreciate, and the excellent news is that we have for the first time a regulatory sandbox in a European text, and we want to make it work. So we have also tons of suggestions for that. So if I may conclude, the AI text, the AI Act for us is the tip of the iceberg. We are fully conscious and aware as an AI Startup Association that the battle will actually arrive when we'll talk about norms and standards. So we'll have a second fight to have with at the international level, and I mean as European players. We need to be, I think, as European players, much more aggressive on norms and standards so that it reflects our values at the global level. So as a startup organization, we'll be much more involved on that as well. That will be the second part of the debate.
Right, indeed. Thanks a lot. It gives me the perfect transition, so to speak, to Francesco, because we heard the perspective from the AI ecosystem in France, so to speak. So we've heard you speak a lot about the potential good things about the Act. You mentioned also the need to remain competitive. And Francesco, is this perspective the same from Italy? What is your perspective on this proposed regulation, and what are your key points to which you're paying a lot of attention, most attention to?
Merci, Julien. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry you cannot hear my voice extremely well, maybe, but I'm a bit sick. First of all, I want to say something, and I'm really happy that also Mr. Gross is here with us. It is not always the case that a legislator is a leader and not a follower when it comes to regulate innovation. In this case, regardless the details that we will definitely go to analyze, there is, and it has already been done, there has been an effort by the European Commission that stems from far away to lead both on an issue that's completely changing. I mean, Julia just mentioned the numbers of the startups that continue to grow in recent years. It would have been easier maybe for the European Commission just to follow and just to look at how the market was evolving. In this case, the European Commission, I think that the effort stems also from, I remember Ursula von der Leyen's first speech when she said already that there was a strong willingness of regulating this field. And I have to tell you, hats off to the European Commission, because they took the risk to lead on an issue and possibly also to kind of pursue a European third way. We know that there is, when it comes to digital policies, an American model, there is an Asian model. We know, and I personally really like this idea that the European Union and the European Commission are strongly pursuing a European third way, also when it comes to artificial intelligence. As I said before, this is, and I guess Mr. Gross would agree with me, just the end of a very long path of studies, of research, and then there has been the legislative effort, which hopefully will see the light very soon. I will follow Julia in saying that the most important thing for us regards competition. Obviously, we want, but I am sure that this is also the willingness by the European legislator to create a level playing field in which the European startups and the European venture capital may benefit from the legislation and not see the legislation as an obstacle. I do think that for the time being, the steps have been done in the right direction. Obviously, we cannot create a situation for which a European startup or a European investor is disadvantaged compared to any competitors in the US or in other countries. It is obviously important, and this is another thing that, in my view, it is easily addressed in the current set proposal of legislation, to avoid the risk of limiting innovation. Therefore, also in this sense, I definitely back what Julia said about the regulatory sandboxes that may be the key to foster innovation on one side without limiting the possibility of being competitive at a global scale. I also strongly like the idea that, contrarily to, for example, what happened with the fintech sector, the idea is to go towards a European-wide regulatory sandbox, because, as you may agree with me, we have on one side to foster the global competitiveness of the European startup when it comes to global competition. On the other side, we want to create an intra-EU level playing field that could possibly be beneficial for all the member states. In the fintech, as you may know, there has been a lot of freedom left to the member states that at the end of the story created different sandboxes, sometimes not really able to, again, foster the competition, but in some situations to create maybe some problems among different member states. Then another thing that for us is important, and it is addressed in the set of legislation that is currently discussed, we think it is important that the voices of the startups, that the voices of the operators of the sector are listened, both as it is happening now during the making of the legislation and after the legislation will enter into force. This is why I think it's very important the provision of the EU-wide committee to monitor the effects of this legislation. All in all, the thumbs is really up. And then I keep for my second answer some other suggestions that hopefully Mr. Gross can take into account for further reasoning. Thank you very much again.
Yes, thank you. And I can certainly relate to what you said about this legislative proposal being built on so much work that had been previously made. I think I remember when I first got into AI, it was quite a few years back, we were only talking about ethical guidelines, and we could even dream at the time of having a legally binding framework on the table. And then, of course, work. A lot of work has been done. We made some progress with the OECD, and then, of course, at the high-level expert group on AI, so that we can now have this legislative proposal on the table. And I really relate to what you said about this being a world premiere, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. Let me turn to Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude, quel est votre diagnostic sur la réglementation qui est proposée et quels sont les points d'attention qui vous semblent les plus importants? Jean-Claude, peut-être vous êtes en mute.
Déjà, merci de donner la parole au CIGREF. Je vais le faire effectivement en français. Je crois que le texte est assez précis et je souhaiterais insister sur des points qui sont des points relativement fins. Bon, déjà, un point, c'est que le CIGREF ne travaille pas seul sur ce texte. Nous travaillons avec nos associations sœurs, Voice en Allemagne, Beltux en Belgique, CIO Netherlands Platform en Hollande, et nous convergeons sur notre analyse du texte. L'intelligence artificielle représente un enjeu de très fort de compétitivité pour nous. Elle est déjà présente au cœur de nombreux processus industriels, et donc nous portons la plus grande attention au texte en préparation. Je voudrais souligner que, comme ça a été dit précédemment, nous nous réjouissons et nous approuvons le fait que l'Europe soit leader dans le fait de mettre en place un cadre régulatoire et permettre en fait de protéger des droits fondamentaux, de maintenir, d'instaurer la confiance. Kilian insistait sur ce terme de confiance tout à l'heure, nous partageons cette analyse, et tout en favorisant aussi l'innovation, parce que cet ensemble de technologies peut apporter beaucoup d'innovation et beaucoup de richesse dans nos économies européennes. Alors, une fois que ce cadre-là est posé, nous avons quelques points d'attention. D'abord, nous souhaitons que ce texte permette de bien circonscrire ce qu'on met derrière le mot d'intelligence artificielle et de ne pas donner une définition trop extensive du terme d'intelligence artificielle. Parce que tel que c'est indiqué dans le texte aujourd'hui, à son article 3, dans l'annexe 1, l'intelligence artificielle va recouvrir jusqu'à des approches statistiques, des méthodes de recherche et d'optimisation. Et il nous semble que ça élargit le champ à un nombre considérable de systèmes d'information que nous opérons et qui existent pour certains déjà depuis longtemps. Et donc, pour nous, il conviendrait de bien distinguer effectivement les systèmes qui ont une capacité d'apprentissage autonome et qui sont capables d'être relativement décisionnels, et ceux qui sont plus en appui de l'analyse de la décision humaine. Bref, il nous semble qu'il y a un travail complémentaire à faire pour bien circonscrire ce qu'on met derrière le terme d'intelligence artificielle. Le deuxième point d'attention, c'est que nous partageons, la classification à 4 niveaux de risque. Nous sommes d'accord avec cette classification, mais nous pensons qu'il faut aussi bien circonscrire la catégorie des systèmes d'intelligence artificielle dits à haut risque, de façon à pouvoir se concentrer sur l'essentiel et y faire porter l'essentiel de nos efforts. Le troisième point, c'est qu'il nous semble que ce texte doit veiller à bien répartir les responsabilités entre les différents acteurs, et notamment entre les fournisseurs. Pour nous, c'est très souvent des grands éditeurs de logiciels, ceux qui sont appelés par exemple au titre du DMA, ceux qui sont appelés les gatekeepers par exemple. Mais donc, il y a ces acteurs-là, et puis il y a les utilisateurs professionnels qui, au titre du texte, nos membres, peuvent être eux-mêmes considérés comme des fournisseurs. Et donc, la relation contractuelle entre nous et les grands éditeurs de logiciels est souvent déséquilibrée. Et le texte doit pouvoir apporter des garanties que les grands éditeurs ne vont pas se défausser de leurs responsabilités sur leurs grands clients. Alors, c'est d'autant plus important que ça peut provoquer un handicap de compétitivité en Europe pour nos propres entreprises. C'est-à-dire que nos startups, par exemple, pourraient vouloir appliquer à la lettre le texte, pendant que les très grands acteurs, eux, se défausseraient sur l'essentiel de leurs clients et échapperaient à la réglementation. Ça serait le pire et c'est le point à éviter. Donc, pour nous, un des points importants, c'est que lorsque nous utilisons dans nos grands systèmes d'information des composants logiciels et que ces composants logiciels comportent de l'intelligence artificielle développée par des grands éditeurs, il faut qu'on puisse reporter la responsabilité sur les grands éditeurs de ce qui nous incombe dans nos systèmes d'information. Et par exemple, sur les données qui servent à faire des tests ou par exemple sur la cybersécurité, je vais prendre un exemple. Si moi je suis DSI d'Enedis, si j'utilise pour un système d'optimisation de la conduite du réseau des briques d'intelligence artificielle qui me viennent de grands éditeurs, il faut que je puisse répercuter mes obligations aussi sur ceux qui ont développé l'ensemble des bouts de code que j'utilise en matière d'intelligence artificielle. Enfin, dernier point, il faut garder en tête le fait que nous autres grands industriels, grands clients des solutions informatiques, nous n'avons pas toujours vraiment le choix des éditeurs qui viennent équiper nos systèmes d'information, ne serait-ce que pour des questions d'interopérabilité. Quand j'ai des très grands systèmes d'information qui sont fournis par un grand éditeur, parfois les composants d'intelligence artificielle qui peuvent s'interconnecter avec ces grands outils sont souvent ceux du même éditeur. Et donc, nous avons une relation qui est souvent contractuelle, souvent déséquilibrée en faveur des grands éditeurs. Et donc, nous devons pouvoir répartir la responsabilité entre nous et nos fournisseurs. Voilà, ce sont des sujets qui sont un peu délicats, qui méritent du fine-tuning dans le texte. Et donc, c'est la raison pour laquelle je voulais attirer l'attention des intervenants de cette table ronde et de notre auditoire sur ces différents points.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Claude. I took some notes, very good points about the definition. And we have a lot of debates about the definition. Second point, also very interesting about having a list of high-risk AI application that is extremely clear. And we mentioned also this in quite a few of the panel discussions, and also we mentioned the fair balance of responsibilities within the actors. So thanks for these great points. And now I want to go back to you, Kilian, because obviously you proposed the legislative proposal in April last year, and now it is in the hands of the co-legislators. So under the Portuguese, Slovenian, and French presidencies, the text has moved forward already quite a bit. And also in the parliament, the text has moved forward. It moved a bit slowly until the end of last year, but now that we have the committees that are in charge of the act, things are moving much quicker in the parliament as well. So how do you see this progress of the legislation, both in the European Parliament and in the Council? And are you expecting maybe at this stage some divergence between the two institutions that will be hard to solve?
Thanks a lot for the question. Well, we are now basically negotiating, let's say, a good year, because we proposed the act on 21st of April 21, and now we are in May 22. So where do we stand? And is this long, or is this disappointing? I don't think so. I think we have now, under the French presidency, we have achieved quite a bit. We will have the first full compromise text. So the French presidency has gone through hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of comments from the 27 member states and has tried to put them together so that we have a first draft compromise text, which can now be discussed by the council, and this will be presented or discussed for the first time then on the Competitiveness Council in June. So I think the ground is quite well prepared, that the Czech presidency can now take the next steps and perhaps solve the big remaining more political issues, which may then be still solved. There may be divergent opinions. So we hope that we will have a general approach, let's say, by the end of this year. On the other side of the street, in the parliament, indeed, it took a moment until the parliament found its configuration, which is as well due to the fact that this act is quite important. And you see this because the Parliament even created a special committee on AI, the AIDA committee. They had a special report. There was a huge interest from different committees, and therefore they needed to involve a number of committees. But now I think it moves very fast, and we are grateful that the Parliament dedicated a lot of attention and priority to this act. So the Parliament wants as well to be ready with the first complete resolution by the end of this year. And then the two co-legislators could really enter into the trilogue negotiations, which are in Brussels in the final stage, when you really the two try to come together, because this is then needed in order to get an act out. Is this long? Yes, it takes a bit of time, but I think we need to realize that it is as well a complex task, because the proposal is a first of a kind. It's not a classical legal proposal where we basically amend the fourth package of something and take the lessons from the past and then do the fifth one, or we could not really have reference to existing structures. So it's a first of a kind legislation on a completely new technology. We need to find ways how to deal with a fast-moving target like AI, where we don't even know which will be the risk in 3-4 years. We need to find clear rules for something which is very fast developing and which should allow us to prepare a framework so that we can catch up with developments. And it's extremely horizontal, because AI is used in a robot cleaning your house, as well as in a recruitment tool, or maybe used in combination with a surveillance camera. So this is very horizontal, and this, of course, requires a bit of reflection and a lot of coordination on the side of the member state and in the Parliament. I think it's to a certain extent normal that a number of committees wanted to be involved, as a number of ministries in the member states on the Commission, because we touch on so many different issues. We touch on civil rights, we touch on investigative powers of the police, we have economic aspects, we have technological aspects, we have research aspects. So it's quite horizontal. So it takes a bit of time. I think we use the time very well with hard work. I now think we need to get as well, of course, to the next level. And there we need basically a general willingness to agree. I think, and I'm optimistic, prudently optimistic, not only by nature, but in particular on this file, that there is in general a political will to come to an agreement, still under this mandate, so somewhere next year. There are, of course, some differences in between member states and inside the Parliament, and we will see how this shapes up finally. But if you want to give me a little bit of a sneak preview, what I would think are perhaps tendencies which we can already identify is certainly that in the Council there is a lot of focus on making sure that the AI Act is not stifling innovation. So to make sure that we are not over-regulating, that this is not getting too far or too heavy or really practical. I think that's a key concern. Another concern is how to organize the system so that it is well applied, does not create too much burden for the member states, and nevertheless achieves a uniform application. And the third big concern, I think, is the concern from the colleagues in the Justice and Law Enforcement Department to make sure that they can as well have sufficient access to this technology in the future in order to develop police work, for instance, or the work in the area of law enforcement. On the Parliament side, of course, these concerns are as well present, but there are, of course, other aspects which may as well be perhaps a bit prevalent now in the discussion. You know, the Parliament was quite explicit on a ban on facial recognition. That was a topic which was very much taken up by the European Parliament. There is a lot of discussion on whether the list of prohibitions we have proposed is sufficient, or whether we need perhaps extensions as well on the list of high-risk cases. Another question which in the Parliament is discussed is whether we need further obligations on the level of users, like fundamental rights impact assessments. So that could be, we will certainly see this in some amendments, that this will be proposed. And then the question whether we need redress mechanism or collective action mechanism in order to give more rights to people or persons affected by AI. So that's a bit where you can see a little bit perhaps a different tendency, where on the one side, one institution is perhaps more focused on this question, how to balance this really correctly with innovation and regulation. The Parliament may have, but this is of course all a bit under as hypothetical, and I don't want to overshoot, because first it's the Parliament, it's their prerogative to decide, and second that they all change, and there are a lot of different views in the Parliament. But in general, there may be, let's say, the focus of the discussion a bit more: do we cover all the risks, and do we provide sufficient safety against these risks, if you want to summarize it in one sentence?
Right. Okay. Thank you. So there are a lot of points of attention, both on the Council side and on the European Parliament side. And I would maybe turn that question to either Francesco or Julia. Maybe Julia first. Are you happy with with the direction that the Act is currently taking, or maybe put differently? What would be your suggestions if you were a legislator? What are you wishing for to come about at the end of this process?
So that's an excellent question, and I could go on forever on this. But there are many things that were already highlighted by my colleagues here. I could mention, for example, compatibility between GDPR and the AI Act. I will not expand too much on that one, but I think it's a major pain point for our startups. When they read the text, they are really schizophrenic, and they really ask themselves, what text should I respect, the AI Act or GDPR, because some provisions are not compatible. We also ask ourselves many questions on the responsibility regime, and that's something that Jean-Claude has mentioned. Many startups use small pieces of Google or Microsoft AI solutions that then they redesign to adapt to their own products. So we just need clarity on how would the responsibility work if any risk or problem occurs. So I think I would maybe start with the first important and major point for us, for startups, which is the regulatory sandbox, which is a major opportunity in the text. And Kilian has mentioned it because this regulatory sandbox is an excellent news. I think it's the first time that EU legislation integrates such a provision in the law. And what we would need, I guess, as startups is to have a much more detailed article. So, for example, what is the eligibility criteria and the selection criteria for that regulatory sandbox? What is the duration of the scheme? Is it an exemption of the AI Act or even some GDPR provisions that would be allowed in the regulatory sandbox? Is there any transition period? How do we go from a regulatory sandbox and experimentation environment to going to the market with being regulated? Is there a transition period? What are the conditions of use of the regulatory sandbox? And is there an appeal mechanism if you're a startup and you actually are refused access to the regulatory sandbox? Is there anything you can do to appeal that decision? And the reason why we're asking this is I think Francesco has mentioned that a little bit, is that we just want it to be harmonized across all member states so that we have a regulatory sandbox that is attractive everywhere in Europe and maybe not only in one member state in comparison to the other. So I think here we could look a little bit more at what the UK has done with their fintechs. I think they were one of the first countries to try this regulatory sandbox. So we have a lot to learn, and we would be really happy to help on that and specifying what could be done. Second, and I've mentioned in my previous comments, we have some doubts sometimes on the technical feasibility of certain provisions, and I'll take only one example. It's, for example, on the quality of the data sets, because the Article 10 mentions that data sets should be free of errors and complete. And I think we all know that it's impossible, unfortunately, to guarantee that training data sets are completely free of errors and biases. And I think here the obligation in the respect must be an obligation of means, taking into account the state of the art and the industry practices. For example, should we design a data set that is representative of the population, or should we favor minorities to compensate for their statistical underrepresentation in some cases? So this is the kind of example where I think the text could be a little bit more precise, because data sets can be representative, error-free, and complete only to the extent possible. So these are small additions in the text that make it more feasible for startups. And then we can also specify a little bit how we deal with data minimization, for example, when we refer to the GDPR, and that these two provisions are not in contradiction. And third, I think I would also relate to what Jean-Claude has mentioned on the scope of the text. He has mentioned the definition of artificial intelligence and the definition of the AI risk sectors. We have the feeling that sometimes the sectors and the AI risk, the high risk, are a little bit broad because they cannot entirely distinguish between high and low risk use cases. I will give just an example. Because among the members of France Digitale are particularly affected by the text, the startups in human resources, in HR tech, in legal tech, or in fintech sectors, for example. And if we take only the legal tech sector, we have some startups that have, for example, search engine that help legal professionals navigate through the legal decisions. And the current text actually regulate startups that only provide search engines. Whereas I believe that the intention of the text is really to regulate, predictive justice or cases of robot judges. So this is just an example of how maybe we could have a clearer scope in the text in the AI risk sectors, because we have the thing that some startups might be captured, whereas they are not as risky as we might believe. To conclude, I call the European Parliament and the European Commission and decision makers currently looking at the text to continue. And I thank you again for inviting me and Francesco here today on continuing to consult startups. We're really working together with the Italian counterparts, the Germans. We're working together as startup associations to react on the text. And please feel free to reach out to us if you want to hear more of these AI risk, high risk startups in HR tech, mobility, legal tech. I think that they must be heard in these debates because they will be the concerned by this. So thanks again, and please reach out.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Julia. Great points. Really, I really liked your introduction, so to speak, about the fact that the AI Act is really one piece of the puzzle, and we need to consider the links with GDPR. We need to consider the links with the responsibility and the liability regimes. And then you made basically three main points about how you see sandboxes as a key opportunity. Second, about the technical feasibility of some of the provisions that could be reviewed, even though this process has already started, because I don't think that in the intent of the Commission, this was to be considered as an absolute requirement, but more something to be considered within this state of the art. And indeed, the French presidency introduced this as basically an obligation of means, just like you were wishing for. And third point, also about the scope generally, for it to be very clear. And this is really a constant message that we've been hearing. Guys, whatever you do, do something that is clear for everybody. So I'm very happy to hear these points raised today. And I will maybe turn to Francesco about the same question. If you think some provisions deserve reconsideration.
Merci, Julien. The good thing for everyone, especially for the audience, is that next time you can easily invite just Julia or just me, because I agree with her at 110%. No, joke apart, I will just stress a couple of points, but mainly to reinforce some of Julia's messages. The first thing I noted was, and Julia not by chance did it as the first thing, also her, is the relationship with the GDPR. We know, I mean, it is a fact that in some provisions there are at least some doubts about which norm is stronger. And at the end of the story, and again, Julia said it pretty good, a startup is asking herself, and then they are asking us, I'm sorry, but which norm should I follow? Therefore, this is something on which I think it would be important at least to be really clear. Second point, there is this comes out pretty always when European legislation has a list. It should be an open list or a closed list, especially when it comes to AI Act. I refer to applications and high-risk cases. In my view, obviously, clarity is the most important thing. Therefore, we hope there will be a list that's the most clear possible. At the same time, we all know that artificial intelligence is moving basically on a daily basis. Therefore, it is important, in case the decision will go towards a closed list of application and high-risk cases, to already foresee in the legislation some review, because obviously in 6 months' time there will be possible more or less high-risk cases or more or less applications. Therefore, I think it is important to be extremely attentive in the makeup of the lists. Obviously, we do fully back the precautionary principle, following which it is important to have a broader list, maybe then foreseeing some exceptions. Another thing that is important, I already said it in my first answer, and Julia already said it in her second, it is the absolute value of a regulatory sandbox. But again, building up on what happened with FinTech, we don't have to think that regulatory sandbox is good always. It is good if it is made in a certain way. I think, again, that what happened with the FinTech sector has already taught us some lessons. I think that the way in which it is approached in the legislation, or at least in the makeup of the legislation, is going in the right direction. I just take this minute to underline again how important it is to build a regulatory sandbox that's equal for all the member states, and that's obviously able to create a level playing field, contributing to the global competitiveness of the startups that are then able to move in the sandbox. The last thing, just to be a bit more special than Julien, for the future, I think it is important to continue the dialogue when it will come to the definition of the delegated acts. As we have pretty clearly understand, I think, most of the legislation, because it is a field in which innovation never stops, will then be delegated to delegated acts. And I suggest, I'm sure that Mr. Goss already thought about it, and also the co-legislators, to already include in the legislation, apart for the EU-wide committee I referred before, other fixed and clear means to involve also civil society and the private stakeholders in the various delegated acts that at the end of the story will be the ones that will guide the daily activities of the startups. Thank you again for inviting us. Our doors is always not open, way more than open, and we will be happy to contribute to the makeup of the legislation also, and even before and then at the end of the path with the delegated act. Thank you very much, Julien.
Fantastic, Francesco. And I think it's really a great point about the inclusion of stakeholders that you're raising. So you're mentioning it at the level of the delegated acts, but also I think, and that was the proposition made by the French presidency, to include stakeholders also in the EU AI board in a long-term relationship, not just potential experts that would come as on an ad hoc basis, but really to co-construct what will come out of the EU AI board with the wide inclusion of stakeholders. So great point, Francesco. Thank you for raising it. And Jean-Claude, question un petit peu similaire. De votre perspective, quelles sont les choses qui pourraient améliorer la régulation sur l'IA qui est actuellement à l'étude? quels amendements proposeriez-vous? Que proposez-vous pour l'améliorer? Vous êtes peut-être en mute, Jean-Claude.
I shall say it in English. Maybe it will be easier for everybody. So as one of our main concerns about that text is the fair allocation of responsibilities between software vendors and business users, maybe we could agree on clear and simple principles about this allocation of responsibility. First, coding means responsibility. So we think that some software vendors of AI systems or parts of AI systems must be and remain responsible for the code they write. And business users, on the other hand, are responsible for the proper and the proper use and the proper application of AI systems that they purchase and operate. So it could be a fair principle. We know that it's not so simple because very often when you code building block with AI, the way you code it is linked to the use of this AI system. It's not so simple to separate clearly between the use and the code and the way you code. So we know that it's not so simple, and we know also that some AI building blocks in very large IT systems come from open source. So open source with open source systems, it's not so clear to know who has developed the brick of AI in your IT system. But the principle could be clearly put in the text, and a better allocation of responsibilities requires a review and redistribution of responsibilities under the AI Act for the compliance of high-risk AI systems. And it should result in the software vendors being and remaining responsible for the design of components and building blocks used in these AI systems. So this is our first point and our first proposal. The second point could be to introduce standard contractual clauses, as we have for the GDPR, for instance, and we have some standard contractual clauses for reallocating responsibilities for personal data and between the software vendors and the business users. And we could have the same kind of tools for being compliant with this AI Act and make software vendors and business users co-responsible of AI system. So these are our two main proposals to improve the text and make it relevant for our activities. Thank you very much, Julien.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Thank you. And I think we are very close to the end of this panel discussion. Unfortunately, I had a lot of further questions to ask you regarding the fact that we need to be careful about the regulation, the need for it to be very agile, given that we are dealing with emerging technologies. So the need for it to be revised as necessary. Also about the governance and the role of the Commission. So we don't have the time now to do one last round of question. So I will turn it to you if maybe in 30 seconds you have a closing remark you wanna say before we end on this panel. Maybe Kilian, I get asked a lot by startups and SMEs that I meet, when will the act come into force? My question to you, I don't know, my answer I give them is I don't have any crystal ball, but I hear that the Parliament is aiming at having its position at the end of at this year, so at the plenary in November. Do you think it's realistic? And when do you think, if you had an informed guess to do about the act coming into force, what would you say?
Well, I unfortunately have no crystal ball neither. That's I regret this a lot, but I think that we will have common positions of Parliament and Council by the end of the year or at the latest beginning of next year. So we will see in 23 then really the final negotiations between Council and Parliament. And I hope that we will then find an agreement. The background is, of course, that in 24, there will be new Parliament elections. So the last plenary in the Parliament who could adopt then the act from the Parliament side would be somewhere in January 24. So that's the ultimate timeline. Yeah. It would then enter into force 2 years later because we have foreseen a 2-year transitional period. So you have to, whatever the date X will be, it will be X plus 2 will then be the moment in time when it really becomes relevant for operators. And just to ensure everybody, it will not apply retroactively to any AI system which is on the market. It will only after this transitional period, so you will always have time to prepare. It will apply to those who then come newly on the market or are substantively changed. So there's no reason, I think, to worry, but there's, of course, a good reason to start to prepare, for instance, on your quality management system or on other elements where you want to have a look at.
Right, fantastic. Yeah, well, thank you very much to all of you. I think it was a very informative panel. There are a lot of further issues to be covered, but maybe for another one. So I really thank you, Kilian, Julia, Jean-Claude, and Francesco for participating in this panel today. I thought hopefully you find it useful, and we'll discuss maybe soon for these other topics. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you for your participation, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.